The Georgia sun was a physical weight, a molten coin pressed against the back of Silas's neck. At mid-August, the air didn't move. It simply hung there, thick with the scent of damp earth, sun-baked dust, and the cloying, sweet rot of the nearby swamps. Before him stretched the great oaks plantation, a sea of white bowls that looked from a distance like a dusting of premature snow. But there was no coolness here. Silas bent his back, his fingers moving with a practiced, rhythmic violence. Reach, pluck, toss. Reach, pluck, toss. The cotton husks were sharp, like dried teeth, scoring thin red lines across his calloused fingertips. He didn't feel the sting anymore. After 24 years on this earth, all of them spent within the 3-mile radius of the master's manor, his body had become a map of scars and hardened leather. Around him, the echoes began. It started with a low hum from Big Ben, a few rows over, a vibration that seemed to come from the soil itself rather than a human throat. Then, Aunt Hattie joined in, her voice a weathered rasp that carried the weight of 1,000 Sundays. Go down, Moses weighed down in Egypt land. To a passing overseer, it was just a work song, a tool to keep the pace, to ensure the hands moved in time with the sun. But to Silas, the song was a ledger. It was a rhythmic counting of the days they had survived and a mourning for those they had lost. Every note echoed the ghosts that haunted the furrows of this field. He could almost see them. His mother, sold to a trader from Louisiana when he was 7. His brother, who had run toward the woods and never walked back out. And the countless others whose blood had fed the very stalks they now harvested. Keep your head down, Silas. A voice whispered from the next row. It was Sarah. She was barely 19, her eyes perpetually wide with a flickering sort of terror that she tried to hide behind a mask of exhaustion. Her hands were trembling. She was falling behind, her burlap sack only half full. I can't. The heat, Silas. It feels like the sky is closing in. She breathed, her voice cracking. Silas didn't look up. Looking up invited the eyes of Mr. Gable, the overseer who sat atop a bay mare at the edge of the field, his long-necked whip coiled like a sleeping viper against his thigh. Don't think on the heat, Sarah, Silas muttered, his hands moving faster, surreptitiously dropping handfuls of his own harvest into her sack as they neared the end of the row. Think on the river. Think on the water, moving cold over the stones. Just keep your feet planted. There is no river for us, she choked out. There is, Silas said, his voice dropping to a register so low it was nearly swallowed by the rustle of the leaves. The North Star is still where God put it. It hasn't moved an inch. The crack of a whip fractured the air, sharp as a pistol shot. The singing faltered for a heartbeat, then resumed, louder and more desperate. Silas felt the vibration of the horse's hooves before he heard Gable's voice. Less talk, more picking. You think the master pays for your conversation. Gable roared. He was a man made of leather and malice, his face perpetually reddened by whiskey and the sun. He trotted the mare past Silas, the shadow of the horse falling over him like a temporary shroud. Silas waited until the shadow passed. He felt a familiar heat rising in his chest. Not the heat of the sun, but the slow-burning fire of a man who had realized that his life was being stolen one handful of white lint at a time. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, bleeding purple and bruised orange across the sky, the workers were marched back toward the quarters. The big house sat on the hill, its white pillars gleaming like bleached bones. Inside, there would be candlelight, iced tea, and the soft chime of silver against porcelain. Down in the quarters, there was the smell of salt pork, the ache of overworked joints, and the suffocating silence of the weary. Silas sat on the dirt floor of his cabin, watching the first few stars prick through the indigo canopy of the night. He rubbed a piece of flint he had found in the field, a small, sharp stone that felt like a secret. The echoes of the field followed him even here. He could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the wooden slats, sounding like the distant cries of the auction block. He thought about the Midnight Constellation, the map his grandfather had whispered about before he died. It wasn't written on paper. It was written in the sky and carved into the stories hidden within the songs they sang. He looked at his hands. They were stained with the red clay of Georgia, a soil that claimed to own him. But as he looked toward the dark silhouette of the woods, the iron woods that stood like sentinels between him and the unknown, he knew the echoes were changing. They were no longer just songs of mourning. To Silas, the wind was starting to sound like a call. He closed his eyes and saw it. A river, wide and dark, a trail through the thorns, and a star that refused to move. The cotton fields had his sweat, his blood, and his youth. But as the moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plantation, Silas made a silent vow to the ghosts in the soil. He would not give them his soul. The journey hadn't begun with a step. It had begun with a thought. And as the cicadas began their rhythmic thrumming in the trees, Silas began to count. Not the pounds of cotton, but the miles to the Ohio River. The echoes of the field were loud, but the silence of the north was calling louder. The moon that night was a silver scythe, a thin, curved blade hanging precariously over the jagged silhouette of the Georgia pines. It provided just enough light to turn the world into a landscape of gray ghosts and elongated shadows, but not enough to guide a man's footing through the treacherous roots of the swamp's edge. For Silas, the darkness was no longer a shroud. It was a sanctuary. He moved with the silence of a predator, though he felt more like prey. Every snap of a dry twig under his feet sounded like a bone breaking. Every rustle of the wind through the Spanish moss felt like a reaching hand. He was heading toward the Hush Harbor, a dip in the land near the Blackwater Creek where the cypress knees rose like jagged teeth from the muck. It was a place where the overseers rarely ventured, feared for its cottonmouth snakes and the heavy, stagnant air that bred fever. When he reached the clearing, he wasn't alone. Two figures stood by the base of an ancient, lightning-scarred oak. One was Sarah, her thin frame shivering despite the humid warmth of the night. The other was old Ezra. Ezra was a man of indeterminate age, his skin the color of scorched earth, and his eyes clouded by cataracts that seemed to glow in the moonlight. They called him the Conjurer in the quarters, but Silas knew him as something else, a keeper of maps. "You're late, Silas," Ezra whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a porch. The patter-rollers were out on the main road. "I had to circle back through the briars," Silas replied, wiping a smear of blood from a fresh scratch on his cheek. Sarah stepped forward, her hands clenched at her chest. "Silas, we can't do this. I heard the master talking to the trader today. He's looking to sell 3 more by month's end. If we're caught tonight, we won't just be whipped. We'll be broken." Silas looked at her, then at the sliver of moon above. "We're already broken. Sarah, every day we wake up under his roof, we lose a piece of ourselves that we ain't ever getting back. I'd rather the hounds find me a free man than the sun find me a slave another year." Ezra stepped between them, reaching into the folds of his ragged coat. He pulled out a small, weathered book, a Bible, missing its cover and half its pages, and a rusted iron nail. "If you move toward the North Star," Ezra said, his voice gaining a sudden, rhythmic weight, "you leave the world you know behind. There is no coming back. There is no sorry if you get tired. You are entering into a covenant, not just with each other, but with the ones who died trying to do what you're about to do." He knelt in the soft mud, and Silas and Sarah followed. The air around them seemed to thicken, the hum of the cicadas rising in a deafening crescendo, as if the forest itself were witnessing the moment. "Place your hands on the word," Ezra commanded. Silas laid his broad, calloused palm over the thin, yellowed pages. Sarah hesitated, then placed her smaller, trembling hand over his. "Under this crescent moon," Ezra began, "you swear to be the eyes for the blind and the legs for the weary. You swear that if one falls, the other carries. You swear that no matter the cold, no matter the hunger, No matter the lash of the hounds, you will not turn back to the house of bondage. I swear, Silas said, his voice steady, echoing the iron resolve that had been forging in his heart for years. I swear, Sarah whispered, her voice fragile but gaining strength. Ezra took the rusted nail and made a shallow prick in the center of Silas's thumb, then Sarah's. He pressed their thumbs together over the Bible. It was a primitive, visceral seal, a mixing of blood and spirit in the middle of a wilderness that belonged to a man who claimed to own their bodies, but could never own this moment. The drinking gourd is your guide, Ezra whispered, pointing toward the constellation of the Big Dipper, which hung faintly in the sky. The moss grows on the north side of the trees. The river will wash your scent, but the mountains will test your lungs. You leave when the moon vanishes 3 nights from now, when the sky is as black as the bottom of a well. Why then? Sarah asked. Because a man can't hunt what he can't see, Ezra replied. And the master thinks his property is too afraid of the dark to ever use it as a bridge. Silas looked at the crescent moon. To most, it was a symbol of the passing month. To him, it was a celestial fingernail scratching at the door of freedom. He felt a strange, cold electricity humming through his veins. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a piece of equipment listed in a ledger. He felt like a man with a destiny. We need supplies, Silas said, his mind already churning with the logistics of survival. Extra salt, a knife if I can steal one from the smokehouse, and dry socks. I'll get the salt, Sarah said, her fear finally replaced by a grim necessity. And I'll stitch some extra leather into our boots. Good, Silas nodded. He looked at Ezra. And you? Why are you helping us? You're too old to run, Ezra. If they find out you showed us the way. The old man let out a soft, wheezing laugh that turned into a cough. He looked up at the moon, his milky eyes reflecting the silver light. I've sent many to the river, Silas. Some made it. Some are feeding the oaks. But every time one of you crosses that line, a bit of my own soul goes with you. I may die in these quarters, but parts of me are already living free in Philadelphia and Canada. I'm just making sure a bit more of me gets out before the light fades. They stood in silence for a long moment, bound by the blood on the pages and the weight of the promise they had made. The covenant was struck. There were no signatures, no legal seals, and no witnesses other than the trees and the moon. But to the 3 of them, it was more binding than any law written by the men in the big house. As they began to slip back toward the quarters, moving separately to avoid suspicion, Silas turned back one last time. The crescent moon was dipping lower, almost touching the horizon. It looked like a silver gate, cracked just wide enough for a soul to slip through. He touched the small wound on his thumb. The sting was a reminder. The blood was a map. The journey had finally begun. The sound reached Silas before the sight did. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the roar of a predator, but the sound of 1,000 miles of water moving with the weight of history. They stood on the muddy banks of the Kentucky side, hidden within a dense thicket of skeletal willow trees. After weeks of traveling by the light of the drinking gourd, through the briars of Tennessee and the limestone caves of Kentucky, the Ohio River finally lay before them. In the moonlight, the water looked like a sheet of hammered obsidian, vast and indifferent. To the white men in the towns behind them, it was a trade route, a vein of commerce for coal and timber. To Silas and Sarah, it was the Great Divide, the liquid border between being a person and being a piece of property. It's too big, Silas, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. She looked smaller than she had back at the plantation. Her clothes were shredded by thorns, and her eyes were sunken from weeks of hunger. But there was a new, hard light in them. We can't swim that. Not in this cold. Silas didn't answer immediately. He was watching the far shore. Across that black expanse lay Ohio. It wasn't the promised land yet. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that hunters could still snatch them from the streets of Cincinnati or the woods of Chillicothe, But it was the first step toward a life where no man could legally put a price on their heads. "We don't swim," Silas said, spotting a flicker of light on the opposite bank. "We wait for the signal." Ezra had told them to look for a lantern swung in a circle 3 times near the mouth of the creek. They waited in the damp cold, the frost beginning to crystallize on the collars of their coats. Every snap of a twig behind them felt like the arrival of a bounty hunter's hound. Silas clutched the rusted iron nail Ezra had given him, pressing it into his palm until it drew blood. He needed the pain to stay awake, to stay sharp. Then it appeared, a tiny amber spark across the water. 1 circle, 2, 3. From the darkness of the river, a low, rhythmic thud clack emerged. It was the sound of muffled oars. A small skiff materialized out of the fog like a ghost ship. The man at the oars was massive, his skin so dark he seemed carved from the night itself. He didn't speak as the boat's prow hissed into the Kentucky mud. He simply nodded. Silas helped Sarah into the boat. She stumbled, her legs weak from the trek, but the man caught her with a hand as steady as an anchor. Silas climbed in behind her, his eyes scanning the ridgeline one last time. He half expected to see the torches of Gable and his men cresting the hill, but there was only the silent, mocking dark of the south. As they pushed off, the current seized them. The Ohio River was a living thing, powerful and deceptive. The skiff tilted precariously, and Sarah gasped, clutching the gunwales. "Stay low," the oarsman grunted. His voice was like grinding stones. The river patrols have steam launches. If they see a shadow out of place, they fire first and ask for papers later. The middle of the river felt like a void. Behind them, the lights of Kentucky faded into the mist. Ahead, the shore of Ohio remained a distant, indistinct smudge. In this liminal space, Silas felt a strange sense of weightlessness. For the first time in his life, he was neither here nor there. He wasn't on the plantation, but he wasn't yet free. He was in the divide, a place where the laws of men were suspended and only the laws of the water mattered. Suddenly, a bright white beam cut through the fog a few hundred yards downstream. A riverboat was chugging north, its great paddle wheel churning the water into a frothy white blood. "Down!" the oarsman hissed. Silas threw his body over Sarah, pressing her into the damp floorboards of the skiff. The smell of old fish and river mud filled his lungs. The sweep of the steamboat's searchlight passed over them, a giant, inquisitive eye searching for runaway souls. The light lingered on a patch of driftwood just 10 feet from their boat, the heat of the beam almost palpable through the mist. Silas held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't let it in here," he prayed. "Not in the water. Not when I can see the other side." The light moved on. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the steamboat faded into the distance. The oarsman began to row again, his muscles straining against the current. With every stroke, Silas felt the tension in his chest begin to snap. The air even felt different, sharper, thinner, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a different kind of world. The skiff's bottom eventually scraped against sand. The oarsman hopped out into the knee-deep water and pulled the boat onto the bank. Silas stepped out, his boots sinking into the Ohio mud. It felt no different from Kentucky mud. It was cold, wet, and cloying. But as he reached back to pull Sarah onto the shore, he felt a sudden, violent shiver run through his frame. He knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the earth. "We're across," he whispered. Sarah stood beside him, looking back at the dark ribbon of the river they had just conquered. On the other side lay the cotton fields, the lash, the ledgers, and the echoes of their ancestors. On this side, there was only the dark woods and a long road ahead. "Is this it, Silas?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Are we free?" Silas looked at the oarsman, who was already pushing his boat back into the water, preparing for the next soul he would ferry across the divide. "No," Silas said, standing up and looking toward the north. "We're just on the right side of the fight now. but the river is behind us. From here on, we walk on ground that doesn't belong to the master. The Ohio River flowed on, a great, silent witness to the thousands who had crossed it and the thousands more who hadn't. Silas and Sarah turned their backs on the water and disappeared into the Ohio timber, two shadows moving toward a light that only the desperate can see. The farmhouse stood like a silent sentinel against the gray Ohio dawn. To a casual traveler, it was merely the home of Thomas Wright, a quiet, unremarkable widower known for his prize-winning apples and his devotion to the local Quaker meeting house. But to Silas and Sarah, who had spent the last 3 miles crawling through frozen cornstalks, the house was a station, and Thomas Wright was the station master. The signal had been subtle, a single candle burning in the attic window, veiled by a lace curtain. "Friend, come in," a voice whispered from the darkness of the porch. It was Thomas. He didn't use names. Names were dangerous things that could be beaten out of a man. He ushered them into a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, scents that felt like a cruel taunt to two people who hadn't eaten a hot meal in weeks. But they didn't linger in the warmth. Thomas pulled back a heavy braided rug beneath the oak dining table, revealing a trapdoor so perfectly fitted that the grain of the wood barely showed a seam. "Down quickly," he urged. "The local sheriff has been patrolling the road since midnight. There are men in town, bounty hunters from the south. They have papers, and they have no respect for the borders of a free state." Silas descended first, his boots hitting a dirt floor. He reached up to help Sarah down. As the trapdoor closed above them, the world vanished into a suffocating, absolute black. A moment later, a sliver of light appeared as Thomas followed them down, carrying a low-burning oil lamp. The cellar was a labyrinth of shadows. Cates of potatoes and jars of preserved peaches lined the walls, but Thomas led them toward the very back, behind a massive cider barrel. He pressed a hidden lever, and a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a cramped, low-ceilinged chamber no larger than a wagon bed. "This is the secret," Thomas whispered. "Stay quiet. Even the walls have ears in times like these." The chamber was lined with wool blankets to muffle sound. Silas and Sarah sat on the floor, their knees touching. The transition from the vastness of the river to the claustrophobia of the cellar was jarring. Silas felt the weight of the earth above him. He wasn't just hiding, he was buried. Thomas set down a tray with thick slices of bread, salted beef, and 2 mugs of cider. "The next conductor will be here tomorrow night if the weather holds. He'll take you 20 miles north to a warehouse near the canal." "Why do you do it?" Sarah asked, her voice a fragile rasp. She looked at Thomas's hands. They were the hands of a man who worked the soil, much like theirs, yet he lived in a world of law and property. You could lose everything. This house, your land, your life. Thomas paused, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows across his weathered face. He looked at Silas, then at Sarah, with eyes that seemed to see far beyond the cellar walls. "I'm a man of peace," Thomas said softly. "But there is no peace in a land where one man's freedom is another man's sin. My secret isn't just this room, child. My secret is that I stopped obeying the laws of men the day I realized they contradicted the laws of God. If my house must burn to light your way to freedom, then let it burn." He left them then, the hidden door clicking shut with a finality that made Silas's skin crawl. Hours passed in a strange, timeless haze. They ate the food, which felt like fire in their shrunken stomachs. They slept in fitful bursts, Silas jumping at every sound from above. The whispers of the cellar were constant. The scuttle of a mouse, the groan of the floorboards as Thomas walked in the kitchen, the distant whistle of the wind. Around midday, the atmosphere changed. The heavy thud-thud of boots sounded directly over their heads. These weren't the light, rhythmic steps of Thomas. These were heavy, spurred boots. Silas felt Sarah stiffen beside him, her fingers digging into his arm. "I tell you, right? We tracked them to the edge of your woods. a booming voice echoed through the floorboards. The voice was gravelly, thick with a southern lilt that made Silas's blood run cold. It sounded like Gable's kin. "You are welcome to search my barn and my fields, Sheriff," Thomas's voice replied, remarkably steady. "But I do not appreciate being interrupted during my prayers. I have no one here but myself. We have a warrant for 2 fugitives, a man and a woman, property of the Great Oaks Plantation. There's a $500 reward for the pair," a second voice said, the sharp, cold tone of a professional manhunter. "People say you're a friend to the runaways, right? That's a dangerous reputation to have under the Fugitive Slave Act." "I'm a friend to all who seek the light," Thomas said. "Will you have some cider?" It's a cold afternoon. In the cellar, Silas reached into his coat and gripped the rusted nail. It was a pathetic weapon, but he swore to himself that if the trapdoor opened, he would not go back in chains. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The boots moved across the kitchen floor. Thud, thud, thud. They stopped directly over the rug that hid the trapdoor. Silas held his breath. He could hear the faint jingle of a harness, the creak of leather. He imagined the men looking down, their eyes scanning the floor for a seam, a scratch, a sign of deception. "Nothing here but dust and Bibles," the sheriff grumbled. "Let's check the creek bed again. They might be heading for the Quaker settlement in Wilmington." The voices faded. The front door slammed. Silas didn't move for a long time. His heart was a drum in his ears. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. When Thomas finally returned that evening, he looked 10 years older. He didn't speak as he opened the hidden door. He simply handed Silas a small, handwritten map and 2 heavy wool coats. "The hunters are watching the main roads," Thomas whispered. "The secret is no longer just this room. It's the fog. It's the shadows. You must leave now, through the back orchard. Follow the creek until you see a bridge made of stone. Under that bridge, you'll find a man with a wagon full of hay." As Silas stepped out of the hidden chamber, he looked back at the small, dark space. It had been a tomb, but it had also been a womb. The place where his fear had finally hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. "Thank you, friend," Silas said, using the Quaker term for the first time. Thomas Wright nodded, his eyes shining in the dark. "Don't thank me until you see the North Star over a land that doesn't belong to the Republic. Now go. The night is your only coat." They slipped out into the biting Ohio air, leaving the whispers of the cellar behind. But as they ran toward the orchard, Silas realized that the station master's secret wasn't the room under the floor. It was the quiet, invisible rebellion of 1,000 hearts, beating in the dark, refusing to let the light go out. The sound was a jagged tear in the fabric of the night, a long, hollow, bell-like chime that echoed through the ravines. To a hunter, it was a sound of triumph. To Silas, it was the sound of the end of the world. Bloodhounds, he whispered, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. They were 3 miles north of Thomas Wright's farm, deep in a stretch of timber where the trees grew so close together their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The ground was a treacherous carpet of frozen leaves and slick mud. Sarah stumbled beside him, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. "They found us, Silas," she gasped, her voice thick with a paralyzing terror. "They found our scent at the orchard." Silas gripped her arm, pulling her forward. "Don't look back. Looking back slows the feet. We have to reach the Black Fork Creek. If we don't get our feet in moving water, those dogs will have our throats before the moon sets." The baying grew louder, more rhythmic. These weren't just any dogs. They were retribution hounds, bred and trained for one singular, cruel purpose: to track human fear across miles of wilderness. Behind the dogs, Silas knew, would be the men. He could already see the flickering orange glow of pine knots, torches, dancing through the trees like malevolent fireflies. Gable was back there, Silas could feel it in the phantom ache of his old scars. The overseer hadn't stayed in Georgia. He had followed the stolen property across state lines, fueled by the cold fury of a man who had lost his pride. "Silas, my legs, they won't go," Sarah cried, collapsing against the trunk of a lightning-scarred elm. Her boots, reinforced with leather by her own hands just days ago, were falling apart. Her ankles were swollen, purple with the cold. Silas looked at the approaching torches, then at the woman who had shared his bread and his blood oath. The covenant they had struck under the crescent moon wasn't just about walking together. It was about the sacrifice of the self. "Get on my back," Silas commanded. "No, Silas. You can't carry me and outrun them. Leave me. Hide in the hollows. Maybe if they find me, they'll stop looking for you." "I didn't cross the Ohio to become a man who leaves his own behind," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a sudden, fierce authority. He scooped her up, her weight a crushing burden on his already exhausted frame. His muscles screamed. His lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, but he began to run. He ran with a primal desperation, crashing through briars that clawed at his face and eyes. He didn't feel the thorns. He only felt the rhythmic thrum of the hounds baying, which was now so close he could hear the frantic snapping of their jaws. Then he smelled it, the sharp, mineral scent of wet stone and moss. The Black Fork Creek. It wasn't a river, but a fast-moving vein of water swollen by the early winter rains. It rushed over jagged rocks, white foam churning in the dark. Silas plunged into the water without hesitating. The cold was a physical blow, a sudden, numbing shock that seemed to stop his heart for a beat. He waded into the center, the water rising to his waist, fighting the current that tried to sweep his feet from under him. "Stay still," he told Sarah, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. He moved upstream, stepping only on the submerged stones to avoid leaving footprints in the silted bed. He moved for 50 yards, then 100, his legs turning into pillars of ice. He found a place where an ancient willow had fallen across the bank, its roots creating a dark, tangled cavern over the water. He tucked himself and Sarah into the freezing shadows, pressing their bodies against the muddy bank. Seconds later, the hound arrived. 3 massive curs, their ears torn and their eyes bloodshot with the frenzy of the hunt, skidded to a halt at the water's edge. They paced the bank, their noses pressed to the mud, letting out frustrated, high-pitched yelps. They had lost the thread. The echo of the scent had vanished into the rushing cold of the creek. Then came the men. Silas watched through the veil of willow branches. From men on horseback, their torches casting long, distorted shadows across the water. In the lead was Gable. He looked different here in the north, colder, more desperate. He held a long-barreled rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the darkness with a predator's focus. They couldn't have crossed here. One of the men shouted over the roar of the water. "It's too deep, and the current's too strong. They're probably doubled back toward the ravine." Gable didn't answer immediately. He steered his horse to the very edge of the bank, the animal's hooves inches from where Silas's trail had vanished. He raised his torch, the light spilling over the water, inches from the willow roots where Silas and Sarah lay hidden. Silas stopped breathing. He reached out and covered Sarah's mouth with his hand, though she was already silent, frozen in terror. He saw Gable's eyes, narrowed, searching, for a terrifying second. Their gazes almost met through the leaves. Silas felt the rusted nail in his pocket, a useless piece of iron against a rifle, but he gripped it anyway. If he was to die, he would die as a wolf, not a sheep. The dogs are confused. Gable finally spat, his voice dripping with venom. "But they're close. I can smell the sweat of them. They're hiding in the holes like the rats they are." "The sun's coming up in an hour, Gable," the other man said. "We can't be caught this close to the abolitionist town in daylight. The locals here don't take kindly to us retrieving property." Gable looked at the dark water one last time. He spat into the creek, the glob of tobacco juice swirling away in the current. Run then, Silas. Run until your lungs burst. But you can't outrun the debt you owe. I'll find you in the next county or the one after that. There ain't enough north in the world to hide you. With a sharp whistle, Gable turned his horse. The hunters and the hounds retreated into the woods, the orange glow of their torches slowly fading into the graying light of the pre-dawn. Silas didn't move for a long time. The water had long since gone from cold to agonizing, and then to a terrifying numbness. He dragged himself and Sarah out of the creek and onto the opposite bank, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. They lay on the frozen ground, shivering violently. Sarah was weeping silently, the shock finally breaking through her resolve. Silas looked at his hands. They were white, the skin shriveled and blue at the nails. He had survived the hounds of retribution, but the hunt had changed. It was no longer a chase. It was a war of attrition. "We have to move," Silas managed to say, his voice a ghost of itself. "The Ironwoods. We have to reach the Ironwoods before they circle back." He looked back across the creek. The north was no longer a dream of golden fields. It was a gauntlet of ice, shadow, and blood. The echoes of the cotton fields were far behind him, but the hounds of retribution were the new music of his life. He stood up, his knees cracking, and reached down for Sarah. They weren't property anymore, but they were ghosts, and ghosts had to keep moving if they wanted to see the sun. The trees did not grow in the Ironwoods. They loomed. As Silas and Sarah crossed the threshold of the ancient forest, the world changed. The horizon, which had once offered the distant hope of the North Star, was abruptly severed by a canopy so dense it felt like a ceiling of lead. These were not the manicured groves of the South or the rolling orchards of the Ohio valleys. These were the Ironwoods, a primal stretch of old-growth timber where the trunks of the hornbeams and oaks were as hard as the metal they were named for, and the undergrowth was a tangled mesh of thorns and deceptive shadows. "It feels like we walked into a tomb," Sarah whispered. Her voice, once a bright instrument in the plantation choir, was now a thin, reedy thrum. "Not a tomb," Silas grunted, though his own heart misgave him. "A fortress. Gable won't bring horses in here. The ground is too broken, the roots too thick. If we can get through this, we're as good as ghosts." But the Ironwoods had a defense of its own, disorientation. Within an hour, the path, if there ever was one, vanished. The gray light of the overcast morning filtered through the branches in a way that made every direction look identical. Every moss-covered rock looked like the one they had passed 10 minutes prior. Every gnarled root seemed to reach out to trip them, as if the earth itself were in league with the men they had left at the creek. By midday, the silence became a physical weight. In the fields of Georgia, there was always sound, the rustle of cotton, the crack of a whip, the distant lowing of cattle. Here, the air was dead. No birds sang. Even the wind seemed to lose its way in the labyrinthine branches. "Silas," Sarah said, stopping dead. She was leaning heavily against a tree whose bark was as cold as iron. "We've seen that stump before. The one split by the frost. We're walking in circles." Silas looked at the stump. His stomach twisted. She was right. He looked up at the sky, but the heavy, snow-laden clouds had swallowed the sun. Without the sun or the stars, he was a blind man in a room full of knives. "We need to keep the wind on our right cheek," Silas muttered. Try to recall the woodcraft Ezra had whispered about in the dark of the quarters. "The wind comes from the west this time of year. If it hits us on the right, we're heading north." "There is no wind, Silas," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "There's only the cold." She was right. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Silas felt a surge of panic, a sharp, hot spike in his chest. He was the protector. He was the one who had made the covenant. If he couldn't navigate this maze, they would simply become two more skeletons in the vast, indifferent history of the American wilderness. He closed his eyes, forcing his breath to slow. Think, Silas. Think like the fox, not the hound. He knelt down and began to clear the leaf litter away from the base of a massive oak. He felt the bark. In the south, they said moss grew on the north side of the trees, but in the deep woods, moss grew everywhere it could find a foothold. He looked closer, searching for the leaning of the trees. Trees often grew with a slight tilt away from the prevailing winds. As he worked, a low, rhythmic sound began to pulse through the woods. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Silas froze. It wasn't the baying of a hound or the hoofbeat of a horse. It was a deep, resonant drumming that seemed to vibrate in his very marrow. What is that? Sarah hissed, clutching his shoulder. A partridge, Silas breathed, relief washing over him. A rough grouse drumming on a log. Ezra said they looked for the higher ground to do their dancing. He stood up, his eyes sharp. If the bird was on higher ground, that meant there was a ridge nearby, and a ridge meant an overlook. He followed the sound, weaving through the labyrinth of trunks, Sarah trailing behind him like a shadow. The terrain began to slope upward. The ironwoods grew thinner here, the soil becoming rocky and thin. Finally, they broke through a thicket of laurel and found themselves on a jagged limestone ledge. The view was a shock to the system. Below them, the ironwoods stretched out like a frozen green sea, a chaotic sprawl of branches that looked impossible to navigate from within. But from his height, Silas could see the seam of the land. Far to the north, a thin, silver thread wound through the valley, the canal. And beyond that, the distant, smoky smudge of a town. The industrial frontier, Silas whispered. That's where the smoke is. That's where the iron and steel are. If we reach the canal, we can find the next station. Sarah looked out over the vista, her eyes filling with tears. We made it out of the maze. Almost, Silas said, looking back at the dark labyrinth they had just escaped. But the ironwoods taught me something, Sarah. The North isn't just a place on a map. It's a hardness you have to carry inside you. My heart. It feels like that one now. You can't break it, and you can't burn it out. They sat on the ledge for a moment, sharing the last of the salted beef Thomas Wright had given them. The cold was still there, biting and persistent, but the hopelessness had vanished. The labyrinth had tried to break their spirit by stealing their direction. But in the struggle, Silas had found a new kind of internal compass. As the first few flakes of snow began to drift down from the leaden sky, Silas stood up and offered his hand to Sarah. They were no longer the terrified runaways who had trembled in the Georgia mud. They were survivors, forged in the creek and tempered in the ironwoods. Let's go, Silas said, his voice as steady as the stones beneath his feet. Before the snow hides the smoke. They began their descent, leaving the labyrinth of the ironwoods behind. They didn't know that the next challenge wouldn't be the trees or the hounds, but a human heart as cold and deceptive as the forest they had just conquered. The Judas was waiting in the fog, and the ironwoods had been the last moment of pure, honest struggle they would know before the world of men closed in again. As Silas and Sarah descended from the ridges of the ironwoods toward the canal lowlands, a heavy pea-souper fog had rolled in off the water. It was a deceptive, clinging mist that muffled the sound of their footsteps and turned the skeletal trees into looming giants. In the fog, distance was a lie and direction was a guess. Stay close, Silas whispered, reaching back to grip Sarah's hand. If we lose each other in this, we might as well be back in the cellar. They were looking for the blacksmith, a contact Thomas Wright had mentioned. The signal was supposed to be an anvil struck 3 times at intervals, echoing near the towpath of the canal. But the fog played tricks with sound. Every drip of water from a branch sounded like a footstep, and every rustle of a dead leaf sounded like the cocking of a pistol. Then, out of the white veil, a silhouette appeared. Silas froze, his hand going instinctively to the heavy white oak branch he had been using as a staff. The figure was lean, draped in a tattered gray coat that made him almost invisible against the mist. "Friend of the gourd?" the figure called out. The voice was soft, melodic, and carried the familiar lilt of the South. Silas hesitated. I'm a friend to the North Star. Who's asking? The man stepped forward. He was a black man, perhaps a few years older than Silas, with a face that bore the familiar geography of hardship, a notched ear, a jagged scar across the brow. But his eyes were bright, almost feverish. They call me Elias, the man said, holding up his empty hands. I was sent by the blacksmith. He's got the patter rollers thick around his shop tonight. He sent me to intercept you, take you to a barge waiting at the lock. Sarah let out a small, jagged breath of relief. Thank God. We thought the hounds had circled back. Silas didn't relax. There was something in the way Elias stood, too still, too balanced. On the plantation, you learn to read the posture of a man before you read his face. If the blacksmith sent you, tell me what he uses to light his forge. Walked, Elias talked. He spoke of Philadelphia, of the vibrant black communities in the North, of a man named Frederick Douglass whose words were like fire on paper. He spoke of a life where they wouldn't have to hide in cellars or run through frozen creeks. Sarah was captivated. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, her face lit by the hope of the stories Elias spun. But Silas remained silent. He was watching the ground. He noticed that Elias was wearing boots, heavy, sturdy leather boots with iron-rimmed heels. They weren't the boots of a runaway, nor were they the humble footwear of a Quaker's assistant. They were the kind of boots the slave catchers wore. How long you been a conductor, Elias? Silas asked, his voice casual. 2 years come spring. Elias replied, not looking back. I've seen 50 souls across the water. Each one is a victory over the devil. And what do they pay you? In Philadelphia? Elias paused, just for a fraction of a second. They pay in the satisfaction of a free conscience, brother. There ain't no price on that. They reached a small, dilapidated shack near the water's edge. The fog was so thick here that the canal was only visible as a dark, oily shimmer 10 feet away. The barge is just around the bend, Elias said, gesturing toward the shack. Wait inside. I'll go signal the captain with the whistle. If he sees 3 people on the bank, he might get spooked and keep on drifting. Go on then, Silas said. As Elias disappeared into the fog, Silas didn't move toward the shack. Instead, he grabbed Sarah and pulled her behind a stack of rotting timber nearby. Silas, what are you doing? She hissed. He's going to get the boat. Sure, Silas commanded. Minutes passed. The silence of the fog was absolute. Then a whistle pierced the air. It wasn't the trill of a bird or the low blow of a boat's horn. It was a sharp, military-style blast, a signal for a hunt. From the opposite side of the shack, the fog parted. 3 men emerged. They weren't the ragged hunters they had seen at the creek. These were men in clean coats, carrying short-barreled shotguns. And leading them was Elias. His face had changed. The melodic softness was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. He wasn't looking for souls to save. He was looking for the $500 Silas and Sarah represented. They should be in the hut, Mr. Vance, Elias said, his voice flat. I did like we agreed. Now about the gold. You'll get your blood money when the irons are on him, Judas, one of the white men spat. Check the door. Silas felt a coldness in his gut that was worse than the frozen river. It was the sting of the Judas, the betrayal by one's own kind. Elias wasn't a monster boar of the South. He was a man who had seen the cost of freedom and decided it was easier to sell others than to save himself. Sarah, Silas whispered into her ear, when I move, you run toward the water. Don't look for a barge. Look for a log, a bridge, anything. Just get into the white. What about you? I have to settle a debt with a brother, Silas growled. As the men approached the shack, Silas stood up. He didn't have a gun, but he had the white oak staff and a lifetime of repressed fury. Elias, Silas roared. The men spun around, their shotguns leveling at the shadows. But the fog was Silas's ally now. He threw a heavy stone to the left, and as the hunters fired blindly into the mist, Silas lunged from the right. He didn't go for the man with guns. He went for the man in the gray coat. The collision was violent. Silas slammed into Elias. the momentum carrying them both into the slick mud of the canal bank. Silas swung the oak staff, the wood cracking against Elias's shoulder. "You sold us!" Silas screamed, his fingers finding Elias's throat. "After all the miles, all the blood, you sold your own people." Elias clawed at Silas's face, his eyes wide with a sudden, pathetic terror. "I had no choice. They caught me in Cincinnati. It was my life or yours. Then you should have died a man." Silas barked. A shotgun blast splintered the timber inches from Silas's head. He looked up to see the hunters closing in, their shapes looming in the fog like demons. He couldn't kill Elias, not without dying himself. Silas delivered one final, crushing blow to Elias's chest, knocking the breath from the traitor's lungs. He didn't look back. He turned and dived into the canal, the cold water swallowing him whole. He swam beneath the surface, his lungs burning, until his head broke the water 30 yards downstream. The fog was a shroud. He could hear the hunters shouting, the frantic barks of a dog, and the pathetic wailing of Elias on the bank. But Sarah was gone. He stood in the reeds, the fog clinging to him like a damp grave cloth. He had escaped the Judas, but at a terrible price. The covenant was broken. The fog had taken everything but his life. As he climbed onto the far bank, shivering and alone, Silas realized that the North wasn't just a place of freedom. It was a place where the shadows were longer, and the heart had to be even harder than the ironwoods to survive the coldness of man. The world Silas had known was made of wood, soil, and sky. The world he stepped into now was made of iron, fire, and coal. As he crawled out of the canal and onto the outskirts of the rising industrial hub, the air changed. The crisp, biting scent of the Ohio winter was replaced by a heavy, sulfurous blanket of smoke that clung to the back of his throat. In the distance, the horizon didn't feature the jagged line of the ironwoods. Instead, it was pierced by tall, slender brick chimneys that vomited thick, black plumes into the bruised purple of the evening sky. This was the industrial frontier, a place where the heartbeat of the land was no longer the slow pulse of the seasons, but the frantic, rhythmic thud of steam hammers and the screech of iron wheels. Silas was alone. The betrayal at the canal had fractured his world. His heart ached for Sarah with a sharpness that was worse than the cold water still dripping from his clothes. He had searched the reeds for an hour, whispering her name into the fog until his voice failed, but the water had offered no answer. She has to be alive, he told himself, his jaw set in a hard line. She's smarter than the hounds. She's stronger than the Judas. He moved toward the city, blending into the shadows of the coal yards. Here, for the first time in his life, Silas saw a new kind of humanity. He saw white men with faces blackened by soot and black men with hands calloused by the same shovels, walking side by side out of the foundry gates. They looked exhausted, beaten down by the steel master, just as he had been by the cotton master. Yet there was a difference in their stride. They walked toward homes they owned, carrying wages they had earned. But the city was not a sanctuary. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, these bustling streets were a hunting ground. Posters were plastered on the gas lamp posts, offering rewards for property that had absconded. Silas kept his head down, pulling his tattered coat tight, trying to look like just another weary laborer heading home after a 12-hour shift. He made his way toward the Anchor and Gear, a low-slung tavern near the docks that Thomas Wright had mentioned as a last resort. It was a place where the canal men, the railroaders, and the conductors of a different sort gathered. Inside, the heat was a physical blow. The air was thick with the smell of cheap ale, tobacco, and fried onions. Silas stood by the door, his eyes scanning the room. He felt like a ghost among the living. "You look like you've walked halfway across the world, friend," a deep voice rumbled. A man sat at a corner table, his arms as thick as the iron pipes Silas had seen at the foundry. He was a free black man, dressed in a sturdy wool waistcoat, a pocket watch chain glinting against the dark fabric. "I'm looking for the blacksmith," Silas said, his voice a dry rasp. The man tilted his head. The blacksmith is gone. The hunters burned his shop 3 nights ago. I'm his cousin Miller. I run the coal barges. Silas felt the last of his strength begin to ebb. I lost someone. In the fog. A woman named Sarah. Miller's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the tavern for eavesdroppers. A woman came through here 4 hours ago, shivering, wet, and looking like she'd seen the devil himself. A group of friends took her to the safe house on 4th Street. The relief that washed over Silas was so violent he had to grab the edge of the table to keep from falling. Is she hurt? Scared, mostly. But she kept talking about a man who stayed behind to fight the Judas. I reckon that's you. Miller stood up, throwing a few coins on the table. You can't stay here. The kidnappers, that's what we call the bounty hunters here, are patrolling the docks. They've got the law on their side, but we've got the steel. Follow me. They stepped out into the night. The city was alive with sound. A locomotive whistled in the distance, a haunting, metallic shriek that sounded like a giant in pain. To Silas, it was a terrifying sound, but Miller looked at the tracks with a grim smile. That's the future, Silas, Miller said, gesturing to the iron rails that cut through the mud of the street. Steam and steel don't care about the color of a man's skin. They just care about the coal that feeds him. We're moving the packages on the midnight freight tonight. It's faster than the canal, but it's a rough ride. They reached a nondescript brick warehouse near the rail yards. Inside, beneath the hiss of a gaslight, Silas saw her. Sarah was sitting on a crate, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. When the door opened, she jumped, her eyes wide with that familiar terror. But when she saw Silas, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood up and walked into his arms, her head resting against his chest. I thought the water took you, she whispered. The water couldn't hold me, Silas replied, burying his face in her hair. Not while you were still on this side of it. The reunion was short-lived. Miller checked his pocket watch. The train leaves in 20 minutes. It's a coal tender heading for Lake Erie. From there, it's a boat to Canada. But you have to move. Gable and his men were seen at the telegraph office. They're calling for reinforcements from the capital. As they ran toward the rail yards, the industrial frontier revealed its final face. This wasn't the slow, agonizing crawl through the woods. This was a race against the machine. They climbed into a hollowed-out space beneath the coal in a freight car, the air thick with dust and the smell of grease. The train began to move. It started with a series of violent jolts, clack, 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 as the steel wheels bit into the rails. Then, the chugging of the engine intensified, a rhythmic roar that drowned out the world. Silas looked through a gap in the wooden slats. He saw the city of smoke and steel receding behind them. He saw the glowing orange maws of the blast furnaces and the flickering gas lights of the streets where men were sold. He realized then that the South was an old world built on the backs of the living. But this new world, this world of steam and iron, was a force that couldn't be stopped. It was loud, it was dirty, and it was dangerous, but it was moving north. And for the first time since he had left the cotton fields, Silas felt the momentum of history at his back. We're on the iron road now. Sarah, he shouted over the roar of the engine. She gripped his hand, her face covered in coal dust, but her eyes shining. They were no longer running through the mud. They were riding the lightning of the new age. The hounds of retribution couldn't catch a steam engine. The Judas couldn't follow them into the fire. But ahead lay the frozen gateway, the final coldest barrier between them and a life where they would never have to hide in a coal car again. The cold train groaned to a final, shivering halt on a siding near the edge of Lake Erie. When Silas and Sarah climbed out from beneath the coal tender, the world they found was no longer black and grimy. It was a blinding, monochromatic expanse of white. The air here didn't just bite. It felt like a serrated blade against the skin. This was the edge of the Republic, the Buffalo frontier, where the winds from the Arctic swept across the great inland sea, turning the breath of men into ice and the hope of the weary into a fragile, frozen glass. "We're here, Sarah," Silas whispered, though his jaw was so stiff the words felt like pebbles in his mouth. Sarah didn't speak. She was shivering with a violence that frightened him. Her skin, once the deep, rich hue of polished mahogany, was now ashen, dusted with the white frost of the lake-effect snow. They looked like statues carved from ice and coal. Ahead of them lay the gateway. It wasn't a gate of iron or stone, but a 3-mile stretch of the Niagara River, where the water churned with a lethal, icy fury before plunging toward the Great Falls downstream. On the far side, visible only as a dark, jagged line of timber through the swirling snow, lay Upper Canada, British soil, a land where the Queen's law said no man could be property. "The ferryman," Silas muttered, looking for the signal Thomas Wright had described. A blue lantern behind a stack of driftwood. They trudged through drifts of snow that reached their knees. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Silas felt the old scars on his back tightening in the cold, a bitter reminder of the world he was trying to leave behind. He looked back. Through the curtain of snow, he saw the faint, flickering orange glow of torches near the rail yard. Gable, the overseer, was like a curse that wouldn't break. He had followed them through the cotton fields, over the Ohio, through the ironwoods, and across the industrial smoke. He was the embodiment of the South's refusal to let go. "There," Sarah pointed. A small, flickering blue light winked from the shadow of a dilapidated fishing shack. Silas and Sarah stumbled toward it, their lungs burning with the intake of the frigid air. The man holding the lantern was a giant in a bearskin coat, his beard matted with icicles. He was Captain Jack, a former sailor who had spent 20 years dodging British frigates and now spent his nights dodging American marshals. "You're late," Jack grunted, his voice a low rumble. "The river is choking with shelf ice. If we don't move now, the flows will jam the channel, and we'll be stuck on this side until April." "We had to dodge the patrols at the yard," Silas said, helping Sarah into a small, sturdy rowboat that looked terrifyingly fragile against the rushing, ice-choked water. "Get in the bottom. Cover yourselves with these salted hides," Jack commanded. "The ice will hide the sound, but if the wind shifts, the patrols will hear the oars." As Jack pushed the boat off the slushy bank, a shout rang out from the ridge above. "There, by the shack." A rifle shot cracked through the winter silence, the sound muffled by the heavy snow but unmistakable. The ball hissed into the water a few feet from the boat, sending up a tiny geyser of freezing spray. Silas looked up. At the top of the embankment, framed against the gray sky, stood Gable. He looked like a demon of the frost, his face twisted in a mask of obsessive fury. He leveled his long-barreled rifle again, but the snow was falling so thick now that he was aiming at a ghost. "Row Jack," Silas hissed, reaching for a spare oar. "Stay down, son. You'll tip us." Jack roared, his massive shoulders bunching as he slammed the oars against the slush. The crossing was a nightmare of sound and cold. The river was filled with pancake ice, circular flows that ground against the wooden hull with a screeching sound like teeth on bone. Every few yards, the boat would shudder as it struck a submerged block, nearly tossing them into the black, killing water. Silas lay in the bottom, shielding Sarah with his body. He could hear the ice singing against the wood, a high-pitched, eerie vibration. He realized that this was the final threshold. The frozen gateway was testing them, demanding to know if their desire for freedom was colder and harder than the river itself. "I can't feel my feet." "Silas," Sarah whispered. Her voice was so thin it was almost gone. "Don't feel your feet," Silas whispered back, his lips against her ear. "Feel the north. Feel the soil on the other side. It's waiting for you, Sarah. It's been waiting since the day you were born." Suddenly, the boat lurched violently. A massive floe had struck them broadside, spinning the craft toward the center of the rapids. Captain Jack swore, fighting to keep the prow pointed toward the dark line of the Canadian shore. "She's taking on water!" Jack yelled. Silas sat up, grabbing a wooden bucket. He began to bail with a frantic, rhythmic desperation. The water was so cold it felt like liquid fire on his hands. Behind them, the American shore was vanishing into the white void. The torches were gone. The shouts were gone. There was only the roar of the river and the grinding of the ice. Almost there, Jack gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. I could see the dock at Birdie. Just another 100 yards. But the river wasn't finished. A final jam of ice blocked their path, a wall of jagged white teeth rising 5 feet out of the water. Jack slammed the boat into a small gap, the wood groaning and splintering. We have to jump for it, Jack cried. The boat's going to crush. Jump for the solid ice and run for the lights. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah, hoisting her over his shoulder. He stepped onto a bobbing floe, his boots sliding on a slick surface. He leaped to the next, then the next, moving with a grace born of pure adrenaline. Behind him, he heard the sickening crunch of the rowboat being pulverized by the ice. He hit the solid ground of the far bank and collapsed into the snow. Silence. There were no dogs, no whips, no Judas in the fog, no smoke and steel. Silas rolled over, his face pressed into the freezing Canadian earth. He reached out and grabbed a handful of the soil, squeezing it until it turned to mud in his palm. A man in a dark blue coat, carrying a lantern that burned with a steady, warm flame, walked down the wooden pier toward them. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding his face. "Welcome to the Queen's Bush," the man said, his accent strange and clipped. "You're on British soil now. You're free agents." Silas pulled Sarah up, wrapping his arms around her. They stood on the edge of a new world, looking back across the dark, churning gap they had crossed. The frozen gateway had closed behind them. The American shore was a smudge of gray in the distance, a land of liberty that had failed them, a land of shadows that had hunted them. But here, under the falling snow of a foreign kingdom, the echoes of the cotton fields finally went silent. Silas looked at his hands. The scars were still there. The cold dust was still there. But as he looked at Sarah, he saw the first light of a true dawn reflecting in her eyes. "We're across, Sarah," he whispered. "We're across," she repeated. The journey was over, but the life, the real life, was just beginning. The spring in Upper Canada did not arrive with the sudden, violent heat of the Georgia sun. It came softly, a slow uncurling of green from beneath the retreating skirts of the snow. For Silas, the sight of the first crocuses pushing through the black soil near the Thames River was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was proof that life could begin again, even after a winter that had threatened to freeze the very soul. They had settled in a small community of freedom seekers, a place where the sound of the axe against wood was the rhythm of progress, not the cadence of a labor camp. Here, Silas wasn't property number 42. He was Mr. Silas Rivers. He had chosen the name himself, a tribute to the waters that had washed away his scent and carried him to a new world. He stood now in the doorway of a small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands. His palms were still calloused, but the cracks were filled with the sawdust of cedar and pine, not the red clay of a plantation he would never own. "The tea is ready, Silas," Sarah called from inside. He turned to see her standing by the hearth. She looked different. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, and the frantic, bird-like flutter in her eyes had been replaced by a steady, quiet light. She wore a dress of simple blue cotton she had bought with coins she earned sewing for the merchant's wife in town. To anyone else, it was just a dress. To Sarah, it was a garment of sovereignty. "I was just thinking about Ezra," Silas said, stepping inside. The air in the cabin was warm, smelling of dried herbs and wood smoke. "He'd be proud," Sarah said, placing a tin mug in his hands. "He always said the North Star was a promise God kept. I reckon we're the living proof." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. It was the same wind that blew through Georgia, but here, it didn't carry the echoes of the whip. It carried the scent of the lake and the promise of a tomorrow that belonged entirely to them. A few weeks ago, a traveler from the south had passed through the settlement, bringing news from the other side. He spoke of a country tearing itself apart, of tensions rising between the North and the South, and of a man named Abraham Lincoln. He also spoke of the Great Oaks Plantation. The traveler told Silas that Master Gable had returned from the Buffalo frontier a broken man, his reputation ruined by the escape of his best hands and the money he had wasted on the failed hunt. The Great Oaks was struggling, its fields overgrown and its ledgers bleeding red. Silas had listened to the news with a strange lack of malice. The hatred that had fueled his flight across the Ohio and through the iron woods had evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy indifference. Gable was a ghost in a dying world. Silas was a man in a rising one. "Do you ever hear them, Silas?" Sarah asked softly. "The echoes." Silas looked at his hands. "Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear the singing. I hear Big Ben's hum and Aunt Hattie's prayer. But they don't sound like morning anymore. They sound like a map." "We should write to them," Sarah whispered. "Thomas Wright, the blacksmith's cousin, even the man in the bearskin coat. We should let them know the packages arrived safe." "We will," Silas nodded. "And we'll tell them that the soil here is hard and the winters are long, but the air is so light it makes a man feel like he could fly." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Silas walked out to the edge of his small plot of land. He looked up at the sky. The Midnight Constellation, the Big Dipper, was hanging high and bright over the Canadian pines. For months, that shape in the sky had been a cold, distant commander. It had told him when to run, when to hide, and when to pray. It had been the only law he respected in a land of lawless men. But now, as he looked at the North Star, he realized he no longer needed it to tell him where to go. He was already there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted iron nail that Ezra had given him on that moonlit night in the Georgia swamp. It was pitted with age, a jagged piece of the past. Silas knelt down and pressed the nail deep into the moist, spring earth of his own farm. He buried it there, the symbol of his bondage, the seal of his covenant, and the weight of his struggle. He stood up and exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to pull the last of the Georgia heat from his lungs. "Silas," Sarah called from the porch. "Coming," he replied. He walked back toward the light of his home, his footsteps firm on the ground. He didn't look back at the woods, and he didn't scan the horizon for torches. He was a man who owned his time, his labor, and his heart. The chains were gone, not just from his wrists, but from his mind. The journey that had begun in the shadow of liberty had ended in the light of a new horizon. The echoes of the cotton fields had finally faded into the beautiful, ringing silence of freedom.